Hi, my name is Scott and I just finished my Master in Marine Environmental Protection here at the University of Bangor, and I'm going to talk to you about my Master's project which dealt with carbon storage in UK salt marshes. Now, salt marshes are probably not what you initially think about when you think of ocean sciences or marine sciences. You probably think of water, not of grass, swimming with dolphins, not crawling around in the mud with bugs. But I spent my summer on salt marshes, and it's a very, very exciting environment, and it's also a really, really important environment when you're looking at coastal management and coastal protection. And that becomes quite clear when we take a look at the British coastline. So when we're looking at the British coastline, all these little black dots are areas of coastal marshes. So you see that all the way from the north down to the south, most of the British coastline has coastal marshes. So from a point of view of coastal zone management, it's really important to know what is going on with these marshes, what are the processes that drive them, and what are the benefits that we can derive from protecting coastal marshes. And that brings us to the concept of ecosystem services. The concept of ecosystem services is basically what are the benefits that us humans can derive from any given ecosystem, like for example a coastal marsh. Because of course, unfortunately, that's how most human brains work. We're always asking, what do we get out of it? Why should we protect it? What kind of benefits does the marsh have for us? And does it warrant us protecting it, or should we just drain it, build something else on it, do something else with it, and not preserve it as a coastal marsh? So, what kind of ecosystem services does a coastal marsh actually provide? Probably the most widely known service is flood protection. Obviously, especially at the east coast of the UK, we have lots of issues with coastal erosion and flooding. And if you have a salt marsh, which is always an area that is not built up because you can't settle on it, so it protects effectively the built-up part of the coast where human settlements are. And if you have a flood surge or big storm, and it has to pass over a marsh area before it actually hits the coast where people are settling, it's going to attenuate the wave action, and by the time the waves reach the shore, they're just not going to be as powerful anymore, and they're going to cause less damage. Not only do salt marshes protect from seasonal flooding events, they also generally, over a larger time scale, protect the coast from erosion because of exactly the same mechanism. The power of the ocean, if you will, just gets attenuated, and the coast, the built-up part of the coast, is less affected by erosion. Another service that salt marshes provide, which has found its way more and more into the public eye, is carbon storage. So everyone's talking about climate change, right? So we need to get the greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and salt marshes are actually really important for sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in their sediments. Then there's the service of water purification and detoxification. If we've got agricultural runoff or industrial runoff passing through a salt marsh before it reaches the ocean, the nutrients and the pollutants are actually filtered out by the plants that grow there, so salt marshes can also serve to protect drinking water reserves. Then there's the service of education, so you can take kids or grown-ups out on the marsh and you can teach them about the plants and the animals that live there, and you can help them build up a relationship with the nature that surrounds them, get them out there and get them to appreciate nature and get them to understand natural processes. Then there's cultural services. A salt marsh might be really important to the identity of the people who live in the area. It inspires artists. It's just part of a way of life that people have in that area. It's a recreation. So we can run a marathon in a salt marsh, we can go walk our dog there, so it's part of our everyday life. Marshes are also really important for biodiversity. They harbour a host of species, lots of birds. They are very important stopovers for migratory birds, very important nesting sites, a host of insects, plants. So to preserve coastal biodiversity, it is very important to preserve coastal marshes. Marshes also provide one of the most basic ecosystem services, which is the service of provisioning. That could be the sheep grazing on the salt marsh, or the cows grazing on the salt marsh, and all the things that humans can get off them. I'm going to focus now on the ecosystem service of carbon sequestration. The importance of the so-called blue carbon is now widely recognized. Blue carbon is all the carbon that's stored in coastal and marine ecosystems as opposed to terrestrial ecosystems. If you take a look at the graphic here, this is how much carbon is buried every year in terrestrial forests, and this is how much carbon is buried every year in marine ecosystems. So you can see that for carbon sequestration, marine ecosystems are super important. And salt marshes are here, so you can say salt marshes are the most important marine ecosystems for carbon sequestration. So thinking about a carbon budget of a state and the possibilities of mitigating climate change, it's very important to preserve marsh areas that have this capacity of sequestrating carbon. So how does all the carbon end up in the salt marsh? Two different ways, two different types of carbon that end up there. One is the atmospheric carbon that's taken up by the salt marsh plants, processed and deposited into the sediment. And the other one is carbon that's dissolved as particulate matter in the water column, gets flushed into the marsh, deposited there, and then is also buried eventually in marsh sediments. So within my project, I looked at 4 marshes at 3 different sampling sites. I looked at 2 marshes up there in Morecambe Bay, on the west coast, Sunderland and Lakes, Shell Island, and then Warham on the east coast. So what happens when we get to a marsh? First of all, we set up a transect which reaches all the way from the unvegetated mudflat down here to the terrestrial fringe, which is where the marsh vegetation turns into terrestrial vegetation, not influenced by the processes that influence the marshland. Then we set up our sampling quadrats and proceed to carry a lot of very heavy equipment over very long distances. Our longest transect was 1.5 kilometers through muddy ground, carrying heavy things like sledgehammers, wearing very uncomfortable clothes during the summer heat wave. So it's a lot of tough physical work, but it's a lot of fun as well. The sledgehammer, obviously we need to drive in our PVC cores into the ground. Once we've set up our sampling quadrats, we proceed to do the actual coring. There you can see this very sledgehammer in action. Deal with the cows if there are any. They were very friendly, so sometimes you've got a group of cows cheering you on, which makes work more exciting. And then if you're lucky, you get a very nice core. If everything goes well, you're going to end up with something like this. So what are you going to do with this exciting mud in the tube? You're going to bring it to the lab, you're going to subsample it, take sediment samples at different depths of the core, and then you're going to do all the exciting tests in the lab. So basically, I spent a lot of my summer baking mud cakes. I spent most of my summer baking mud cakes. And if you've done everything correctly, you're going to end up with a lot of exciting data. And a typical pattern of carbon storage down a core is shown here. So if you look at the core like this, you've got a lot of carbon up here, and then as you go down in the core, there's less and less carbon. But we're really interested in this carbon down here, and that's because that is the carbon that is really stable, which means it stays in the sediment. So it doesn't rejoin the atmosphere. That's the carbon we're interested in if we're looking at long-term climate change mitigation, because it leaves the atmosphere and it gets stored in these sediments for hundreds of thousands of years, stays out of the atmosphere, really, really important for climate change mitigation. Sometimes you get exciting cores, like this one. So this one is a stratified core, and that means that up here we have the normal marsh layer, lots of carbon storage, but with this core we have another historic marsh layer here. So we're looking at a couple of 100 years ago. There was a marsh here. There's lots more carbon stored at 40 centimeters depth than we would expect, and that shows one of the challenges we have when modeling how much carbon may or may not be stored in marshland, because when we're feeding data into models, we're assuming very often this curve that I showed you before, which is lots of carbon up top and then just kind of decline going down. But if you have a marsh that's very dynamic and that has historic marsh layers further down the core, it might actually be storing a lot more carbon than we would expect if we're just assuming that it goes just like that without doing something like this.